So in other news, my computer stinks and decided to kick me out of Zoom while Dr. Groake was telling us some important information about what is an argument. So we're going to pick back up right there. So Dr. Groake, what is an argument?
So I would say that my approach, not surprisingly given my background, is to emphasize the logical account of argument. And logic's account of argument, and actually philosophy's account of argument, is that an argument is an attempt to justify some point of view. And the evidence it provides in favor of that point of view is presented in premises. And the point of view it tries to justify is the conclusion. Really, this is a traditional view of argument that, of course, goes back thousands of years. I did, however, want to recognize that I do realize there are other people who understand arguing in a much broader sense, as argument is basically disagreement and interaction that occurs when there is disagreement. At least my work is focused more on, well, what happens when somebody tries to justify a point of view and provide evidence in terms of premises and conclusions. So that continues to be my focus, though I recognize that happens within a broader context, which sometimes is important to our understanding of a particular argument.
So when you identify, or how do you identify if an argument has occurred?
Well, let's say it's sometimes very difficult to identify what should be considered as an argument, because sometimes to settle that, you want to understand what the intentions of the person arguing are, and that's a very complex question. So I think the main thing I would say is I favor interpreting things as arguments. So even when it's unclear, it's interesting to know if in this interchange, somebody presented evidence that justifies a certain point of view. Even if they didn't actually mean what they say in that sense, it's still an interesting thing to do. I would also say that I like a distinction that Jens Kelsen has made between arguments as they're intended by an arguer and arguments, the same argument in some sense, as it is received by the audience. And what I would say is, in many cases, there are actually two arguments. There's the argument that the arguer intends, and there's a different argument, which is the argument that the audience receives, because they interpret what the arguer said in a different way than the arguer themselves. So mostly I'm open to interpreting many things as argument to figure out whether they provide evidence for a point of view. But I would focus often on two kinds of arguments: those that are intended by an arguer and those that may or may not be intended by the arguer, but the arguments that are received by an audience that they understand. And both of those kinds of arguments are worth studying, it seems to me.
Yeah, no, I think that totally makes sense. So let's say you see an argument or you identify an argument, then how do you go about reconstructing it? Because these often might not have all of the premises explicit. How do you go about analyzing an argument?
So the first caveat is that we shouldn't think we can always interpret acts of arguing. I like the term acts of arguing in some infallible way. We can't. I mean, and the greatest example is Plato, so that for thousands of years, people have been interpreting Plato in enormously different ways. And to some extent, there's a bit of indeterminacy there. So first thing I would say is I'm not looking for interpretation of what somebody said or how somebody understood something. I'm looking for something that is interesting enough to be worth studying as an argument and considering as an argument. And maybe it's worth, in this context, to say a little something about art. Because, of course, you know I'm interested in visual argument. And often people will say, well, it's not clear that the artist intended it in the way that you interpreted it. And in lots of cases, in some cases, they may tell you how they intended it, but in lots of cases, we don't know. All I would say is I'm not too worried about that. If somebody observing the art might plausibly interpret it in that way, then that's a potential argument that's worth talking about and thinking about. And many artists, when they produce art, their point isn't so much a specific argument, it's to get people thinking about things. So they're purposely open-ended, and all I would say is all the different ways that you could think about those things as providing evidence for some conclusion, all those ways are worth talking about.
Yeah, no, I think that, yeah, I like that. I like the distinction that you're making, intent versus impact, because I think that brings up a lot of important conversation, right? Now, one of the things that makes me think about is if somebody makes an argument and that they're unaware they're making, does that still confer an obligation on them to defend it?
No, I would say it doesn't, but maybe it creates an obligation for them to clarify, and that's a part of exchange, which is, well, are you saying that we should believe this about education because of such and such? So there's some dialogue that initiates, and I think, of course, asking people for clarification, but you might even say, well, and they might say, well, no, that is not what I intended. You might still say, but it is an interesting thought to think that education should be this way because of what you said. And I think there are probably lots of people that think that way. So let's think about whether that makes sense.
Yeah, using it as a starting
I would, absolutely. But I would say, I think in argumentation theory, we waste a lot of time, too much time, trying to get the perfect interpretation of an act of argument. Because in many, many, many cases, you're not going to be able to get a definitive interpretation. And actually, the history of philosophy is an example of that. The idea, Plato, we interpret as, kind of a radical realist. Within 100 years of his death, the people who taught in Plato's school, the head of the academy, were teaching him as a skeptic who didn't believe anything. He just threw views out there so that people would be forced to argue back and forth, and he really didn't believe anything. Well, who are we to say there are different ways to interpret Plato's philosophy, and provided they're a little bit plausible, they're worth talking about. I don't want to, make the attempt to identify arguments a preoccupation when I do argumentation theory and informal logic.
Yeah, it sounds like you're more interested in, oh gosh, who is the one that wrote that we should just take a paradigm case of argument? Was it O'Keefe?
It might be.
Rather than obsessing about defining and looking for the hard edges of what is an argument, we should instead look at a paradigm case, something we all generally agree that is a case of arguing, and using that to theorize from the center, rather than arguing about the boundary cases and policing the borders.
Sure, okay. I like that very much.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
But I like it.
It's what?
I'm not sure who said it, but
yeah.
I like that sentiment. It makes a lot of sense.
I'm not sure who said it either. I'm just, yeah. I'm trying to remember back to my my grad school days. So, can you tell us how you determine the quality of an argument? So while you might have a broad definition of what counts as an argument, I'm sure you have some tool or method for assessing the quality of arguments.
So, and I would say, well, so I think there are lots of tools. The basic ones I use are a modified version of kind of traditional logic. I wouldn't say we want to know if premises are true or false. I say we need to know if premises are acceptable. And in some circumstances, they're acceptable if they're true, but in other circumstances, for example, in moral claims, in aesthetic situations, it's not clear that we should talk about truth and falsity. Also, I like acceptability because it allows us to talk about audience. So it allows us to ask, are these premises acceptable to this audience or that audience? And maybe even in some cases, the so-called universal audience. Second question I ask is, does the evidence presented by these premises, does it justify the conclusion? So that's very similar in a general way to classical formal logic, though validity in this case and premise acceptability, they're more complex, but those are two basic tools. And then I would add to that a whole lot of other tools. Walton's notion of dialogue. So that if we want to assess and understand whether an argument is a good instance of arguing, what's the dialogue that it occurs in, and what are the expectations and the norms that govern that. I also believe strongly in argumentation schemes. And so here are standard ways to argue, and they typically have good instances and poor instances. The standard way to distinguish is through critical questions. I don't know what I think of critical questions, but argument schemes are another tool that we can use. And
can you give an example of an argument scheme?
So an argument scheme, let's give a simple argument by analogy. That we should believe some conclusion because the situation we're talking about is analogous to another situation, and in that situation, this kind of conclusion follows. And then we can ask a bunch of questions. Well, are the situations really analogous? What are their similarities? What are the differences, et cetera, et cetera. So, another example would be appeal to authority. And that's a standard scheme. In the work that Chris and I've done, we often treat what have traditionally been considered fallacies, we often treat them as argumentation schemes. So argumentum ad populum, for example, appeal to popular view. Well, actually, in some cases, you construct arguing in that sense, and there are good instances and bad instances. So I think of argumentation schemes as sort of recipes for creating arguments. And when you use a certain recipe, there are certain things that can go wrong and certain things that can go right. And argumentations, in a way, they're like rules of inference in formal logic, but they're much more complex. And they explain many more different kinds of reasoning than the rules of inference in formal systems.
That makes a lot of sense. So they're like, under what conditions is it appropriate to appeal to, the popular will, or it might be for a vote. Seems like a good time to appeal to the popular sentiment, right? There are other times.
Popular opinion, where can you trust popular opinion? So yes, and how do we distinguish between the cases where we should rely on this and cases where we shouldn't?
I like that. That makes a lot of sense. And I feel like that's a way more nuanced approach than sort of these overarching, you never can make these arguments. you should always make these arguments approach that you see floating around the internet.
Well, actually, and it's interesting you bring that up, Justin. Think of ad hominem.
Yeah.
The traditional view is that ad hominem is always a fallacy, but it's not. At times it is appropriate to criticize people, and to dismiss their arguments because who they are as people and what their credibility is. So that's very much the approach that I favor.
Yeah, I think sometimes if someone's giving you medical advice, it's appropriate to say, well, you're not a doctor. That would be an ad hominem argument.
That's right. Good example.
Yeah. Well, I think can you give us an example, maybe how your approach to argumentation might illuminate a contemporary controversy?
A contemporary controversy. Well, let me think. So I'm gonna, let me give you a general one. And I need to tie in a different part of what I do, of course, which is I have an interest in multimodality, and especially an interest in visual argument. And I would say that we live in an age where visuality, if I can put it that way, is predominant almost, and becoming more predominant because of the digital revolution. And what tends to matter these days is how people appear in visuals, and applying argumentation principles to the visual is a way to deal with many issues that come up in this regard. And let me take an example. I don't know where to go here. I'm going to take the Dean scream, which I'm assuming you and other Americans know about. So this is when he was running for president and made a gesture and had a funny tone of voice about what he said. And because of that sound, because of what people saw, he basically was no longer in the running to be president of the United States. So, okay, well, this is the kind of arguing that's going on. This is an inference. This person in a squeaky voice made this gesture. That leads to the conclusion that he's not an appropriate candidate for president of the United States. I would say, without going into too much detail, that's not a very impressive instance of argument. What happens with politicians especially is, guess what? Everybody slips up at times. Everybody says funny things. Everybody looks funny at particular times. And to use something that superficial as the basis for eliminating someone from, running for a serious office, well, to me, that's a flaw in reasoning, a flaw in argumentation. And I would say more and more, we're influenced by the visual. So one way in which part of my interest in visuals can apply to contemporary issues really across the board is by promoting a critical attitude to visuals of all sorts. I mean, advertising would provide all sorts of examples. Political campaigning would provide all sorts of examples. So that there's kind of a general area where I think it's a particular help.
That's excellent. Yeah, and I think that's a really good, clear example. Thank you for that. I think before we end, I just want to know, do you have any advice for young up-and-coming argumentation scholars?
Well, so I have a little bit. So what I would like to do is encourage young argumentation scholars in a way, Justin, to do what you're doing. I think that what's happening in argumentation theory is that people from quite disparate disciplines found a common interest in argumentation, and philosophy, rhetoric, communication studies, linguistics, dialectics, etc. And I actually think it's taken about 20 years for these different groups to learn even how to talk to one another and to learn have a shared terminology. So my own feeling is that the future for argumentation theory is for a greater melding of these different approaches and traditions. And I mean, I don't know if I can say what's the right way to a successful career. That's a complicated question. But I think that the future of argumentation theory is, let's say you, from your rhetorical background, to broaden into the rest of argumentation theory, and for philosophy PhDs who are interested in argumentation to broaden their horizons so they understand these different approaches. So that's very much what I would encourage. And I think that can go a long way to developing a much more sophisticated and evolved theory of argument.
That's awesome. I'd like that that advice as a way to end. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay. Thank you very much, Justin, and thank you for doing this project. Much appreciated.
Have a good day.
Okay, you too.
Cheers.
Bye.